In the kingdom of Okigwe, there was a princess like no other. Her name was Adana, and she was the eldest daughter of King Obiagu, ruler of the land. But Adana wasn't what most people thought a princess should be. She was taller than any woman or man in the palace, with broad shoulders and strong arms. Her face was framed by a thick, full beard, the kind that made her look more like a warrior than a princess. She had the heart of gold and the mind of a scholar, but all anyone ever saw was her appearance. The people in the kingdom whispered about her whenever she walked by. The servants in the palace tried not to stare, but they always did. Even the court elders, who were supposed to be wise, often shook their heads when they saw her, as if she were a problem they couldn't solve. Adana pretended not to notice, but their words and stares followed her everywhere. Like shadows she couldn't escape. On the day her father called her to the throne room, Adana already knew what he wanted to talk about. The king had been growing restless, and she'd overheard enough from the palace corridors to know he had made plans for her future. Plans she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. The throne room was grand and cold, with walls that echoed every sound. King Obiagu sat on his tall golden throne, his robe heavy with beads and embroidery. His face was stern, but there was a softness in his eyes when he looked at Adana. Next to him stood Queen Ifunanya, her hands clasped tightly as if holding back words she wanted to say. "Adana, my daughter," King Obiagu began, his deep voice filling the room. "You are my firstborn, the pride of this kingdom." Adana bowed her head slightly. "Yes, father. You know that the people of Okigwe look to us for guidance and strength. They look to us to make decisions that keep this kingdom strong." "Yes, father," she repeated, though her chest felt heavy. She already knew where this was going. The king straightened his back, his gaze steady. "It is time for you to marry, Adana. I have arranged a union with Prince Obinna of Umuse. He is a good man from a powerful family. This alliance will benefit us all." Adana's heart sank, but she kept her face calm. She knew her father meant well. He always did. But how could she explain that the idea of marrying a man she had never met, one who would likely only see her beard and muscles, filled her with dread? "Father," she began carefully, "I understand your desire to strengthen the kingdom, but what?" The king interrupted, his tone sharp now. "Do you not trust my judgment? Do you think I would choose someone unworthy of you?" Adana hesitated. How could she tell her father that she wasn't worried about the prince's worthiness but her own? That no matter how good or noble this man might be, he would look at her and see only what everyone else saw. Someone strange, someone unlovable. "I trust you, father," she said finally, her voice low. "But I need time to prepare for this. It is unexpected." Queen Ifunanya stepped forward then, her voice soft and soothing. "Adana, my dear, we know this is difficult for you, but your father and I believe this is the best path for you, for all of us. Prince Obinna has agreed to meet you at the engagement feast tomorrow. Perhaps you will find him kind." Adana didn't answer. She simply nodded, her throat tight with words she couldn't say. The next day came too quickly. The palace was alive with activity as servants prepared for the engagement feast. Adana watched from her window as decorations were hung and tables were set in the courtyard. She had been dressed in a fine blue gown that shimmered in the sunlight, her hair braided into an elaborate crown. Her beard, as always, was neatly groomed. She hated how she looked, not because she didn't like herself, but because she knew what people would see when they looked at her. They wouldn't see the princess who had spent years learning diplomacy or the woman who could solve disputes better than any court elder. They would only see the beard and the muscles and whisper about how strange she was. When the feast began, Adana walked into the courtyard with her head held high. The guests turned to stare, their conversations stopping mid-sentence. She felt their eyes on her as she took her seat beside her parents at the high table. Prince Obinna arrived shortly after, with a confident swagger that made the crowd buzz with excitement. He was everything Adana expected: handsome, charming, and utterly full of himself. He bowed to the king and queen, his smile wide and practiced. But when he turned to Adana, his expression faltered for just a moment. It was quick, but she saw it. the flicker of surprise, followed by something colder. The feast went on, but Adana couldn't enjoy it. She picked at her food, listening as Prince Obina spoke loudly about his accomplishments. How he had hunted lions, negotiated treaties, and won the favor of kings. He barely looked at her, except to glance at her beard when he thought she wasn't watching. Finally, as the music started and the dancers came out, Prince Obina stood and raised his goblet. The crowd quieted, their eyes turning to him. "My friends," he began, his voice smooth and commanding, "it is an honor to be here tonight. Your king has blessed me with the opportunity to unite our kingdoms through marriage." The guests clapped politely, but Adana felt a knot in her stomach. She didn't like where this was going. However, Obina continued, his tone shifting, "I believe in honesty, and I must be honest with all of you tonight. I cannot go through with this union." The courtyard fell silent. Adana's heart pounded in her chest. Obina turned to her then, his voice dripping with false regret. "Princess Adana, you are unique, but I cannot marry someone who does not meet my expectations for a wife. I hope you understand." The silence turned into murmurs, then gasps. Adana felt the weight of their stares, the shame crawling up her skin like fire. She wanted to run, to hide, but she forced herself to stay still, her fists clenched under the table. King Obayagu stood, his face dark with anger. "Prince Obina, you insult my daughter and my kingdom with your words." Obina raised his hands as if to calm the situation. "I mean no disrespect, your majesty, but surely you can understand. This arrangement is not suitable." Adana couldn't take it anymore. She rose from her seat, her voice steady but sharp. "Enough. There is no need to continue this charade. If the prince does not wish to marry me, I will not force him." She turned and walked out of the courtyard, her steps quick and determined. The murmurs of the crowd followed her, but she didn't care. She only wanted to escape. That night, as she sat alone in her chambers, Adana looked at her reflection in the mirror. She touched her beard, her fingers trembling. She wasn't angry at Prince Obina. She was angry at herself for thinking, even for a moment, that things could be different. She didn't belong in this world of fancy dresses and royal feasts. She didn't want to marry a man who couldn't see past her appearance. She wanted something more. Freedom, respect, a life where she wasn't just the strange princess. By morning, she had made her decision. She packed a small bag, dressed in plain clothes, and wrapped her head in a scarf. She looked at her reflection one last time and whispered, "Goodbye, Adana." Then she walked out of the palace and into the unknown, leaving the princess behind. Adana walked through the dense forest path leading away from the palace, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The humiliation at the feast was still fresh in her mind, the sting of Prince Obina's cruel words echoing in her ears. But her resolve to leave that life behind gave her strength. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew one thing. To survive, she needed to become someone else. When she stopped to rest by a small stream, she caught her reflection in the water. Her beard, thick and full, stared back at her, but so did her long hair, braided neatly in the style she had worn as a princess. The hair was a part of her old life, a part she needed to let go. Adana knelt by the stream, pulling out a small knife she had taken from the palace kitchen before she left. She hesitated for a moment, the blade trembling in her hand. Her hair had always been a source of pride for her mother, who would sit with her for hours, braiding it and telling her stories of strong women from their family line. But now it felt like a weight she couldn't carry anymore. With a deep breath, she grabbed a thick lock of hair and sliced it off. The blade wasn't sharp enough to make clean cuts, so she had to saw through each strand. The process was slow and painful, not because of the tugging of her scalp, but because it felt like she was cutting away pieces of herself. When she finished, her head felt lighter, freer. Her hair was now uneven and close to her scalp, but it didn't matter. It was enough to make her look different, enough to help her disappear into the world she was about to enter. Adana splashed water on her face, washing away the sweat and tears she hadn't realized were falling. She glanced at her reflection again, and for the first time, she didn't see Princess Adana of Okigwe. She saw someone new, someone ready to face whatever came next. By the time Adana arrived at the bustling market town of Amankwu, she had fully embraced her new identity. She was no longer the disgraced princess who had been mocked at a feast. She was Dan, a strong, silent man seeking work and a fresh start. But pretending to be a man was harder than she thought. The market was alive with noise and movement. Traders called out to customers, children darted through the crowds, and the air was thick with the smell of roasted yams and dried fish. Adana tugged the scarf on her head, adjusting it to cover what little hair she had left. She cleared her throat, practicing the deeper voice she had been rehearsing on her journey. "I am Dan," she whispered, testing the words. Her voice felt strange, too low and unnatural. She tried again, this time with more confidence. "I am Dan." Her chest tightened every time she spoke. She knew she had to make the voice convincing, but keeping it steady for hours at a time was exhausting. She hoped no one would question it too much. As she wandered through the market, her stomach growled loudly. She hadn't eaten since the previous day, and the smell of food was almost unbearable. She spotted a stall selling roasted plantains and approached the vendor, a woman with a wide smile and an even wider frame. "How many?" the woman asked. Adana hesitated, then said in her deepened voice, "Just one." The vendor squinted at her, her eyes flicking to the scarf on Adana's head. "You sound funny. Got a sore throat?" Adana's heart raced, but she forced a small chuckle. "Yes, too much dust on the road." The woman shrugged, handing over the plantain. "Well, eat up. A good meal cures everything." Adana nodded and paid her, relieved to have avoided suspicion. She walked to a quiet corner of the market, eating quickly while scanning the crowd. Her disguise seemed to be working for now. The next step was finding work. Adana knew her strength was her best asset, so she approached a group of men unloading sacks of grain from a cart. The foreman, a burly man with a booming voice, was shouting orders. "Do you need help?" Adana asked, deepening her voice as much as she could. The foreman turned to her, his eyes narrowing as he looked her up and down. "What's your name?" "Dan," she said quickly, trying to sound steady. "Dan, huh? Well, grab that sack and show me what you've got." Adana bent down, lifting a heavy sack with ease and carrying it to the storage area. Years of physical training in the palace had made her strong, stronger than most men. The foreman's eyebrows shot up, and he gave a loud laugh. "You're hired, Dan. Welcome to the crew." By the end of the day, Adana was exhausted but relieved. She had worked hard, hauling sack after sack, but she had earned enough coins to buy a meal and a place to sleep. As she rested on a wooden bench, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "You handled those sacks like they were pillows." Adana looked up to see a slim young man with a bright smile and a small wooden box slung over his shoulder. "Name's Emeka," he said, sitting down beside her. "Saw you working today. You're new in town, aren't you?" Adana nodded, keeping her voice low. "Yes, I just arrived." "Where are you from?" Emeka asked. Adana hesitated. "A small village. You wouldn't know it." Emeka chuckled. "Fair enough. So what brings you to Amankwu?" "Work," Adana said simply, adjusting the scarf on her head. "I needed a change." "Well, you picked the right place," Emeka said. "There's always something happening here. I do odd jobs myself, but my real love is storytelling." "Storytelling?" Adana asked, curious despite herself. "Yes, I tell stories in the market. Tales of heroes, tricksters, and adventures. Sometimes people toss me a coin if they like the story." "That sounds interesting," Adana said, though she couldn't imagine making a living from it. "It's not easy," Emeka admitted, "but it's my dream. Maybe one day I'll tell your story, Dan. You look like you've got an interesting one." Adana forced a smile, her heart pounding. "I'm just a worker. Nothing more." Emeka grinned. "We'll see about that." As the sun set, Adana found herself thinking about her encounter with Emeka. His energy and curiosity unsettled her, but there was something refreshing about him. She just hoped he wouldn't get too curious. because she wasn't sure how long she could keep her secret. Life in the bustling market town of Amankwu began to settle into a strange rhythm for Adana, now living as Dan. Each morning, she rose before the sun, wrapping the scarf around her head to hide the uneven stubble of her once long regal hair. Her beard, thick and prominent, no longer felt like a burden but a shield, helping her fit into the world of men she had chosen to inhabit. The deepened voice she had practiced still required effort, but every day it became a little easier, though not without moments of near discovery. One such moment came when she was working with the labor crew, unloading sacks of grain from a wagon. The foreman was barking orders, as usual, when a younger worker stumbled, dropping a sack. The foreman rounded on him with a string of insults, and instinctively, Adana stepped in. "Leave him alone," she said, her voice firm but slightly strained from trying to maintain its lowered tone. The foreman turned, his brows furrowing. "What did you say?" Adana cleared her throat and forced her voice deeper. "I said, leave him alone. He's doing his best." The foreman stared at her for a moment, then laughed. Well, Dan's got a voice after all. I thought you were mute half the time. Fine, I'll let the boy be. For now." Adana exhaled quietly, relieved, but the effort of keeping her voice steady had left her throat dry. These little slips reminded her that she was walking a fine line, one that could unravel with a single careless word. That afternoon, as she rested under the shade of a tree, Emeka appeared again, carrying his wooden box of storytelling props. He plopped down beside her with his usual grin, pulling out a carved wooden figure of a trickster character. "You know," he began, "I've been thinking about you, Dan." Adana raised an eyebrow, her heart skipping a beat. "What about me?" "You're an odd one," Emeka said, holding the wooden figure up to the light, strong as an ox, quiet as a mouse. "And yet, there's something about you that doesn't quite fit." Adana forced a chuckle, though her palms began to sweat. "Maybe I just like to keep to myself." "Maybe," Emeka said, turning to look at her. "Or maybe you've got a story you're not telling." Adana looked away, pretending to be engrossed in a group of children playing nearby. "Everyone's got a story, Emeka. Doesn't mean they want to share it." "True," Emeka admitted, "but stories are what connect us, Dan. They're how we understand each other. Even when we don't say them out loud, they're still there, waiting." Adana didn't respond, but she could feel Emeka's eyes on her, curious and probing. He had a way of asking questions without really asking them, and it made her nervous. She decided to change the subject. "Do you make good money telling stories?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Emeka laughed. "Not really. Some days I don't make anything. But it's not about the money for me. It's about the magic of it. When I tell a story and someone laughs or gasps or even cries, I know I've done something real. Something that matters." Adana nodded slowly. She envied Emeka's confidence, his ability to be himself without fear of judgment. She wondered what it would feel like to live that way. As the days turned into weeks, Adana's disguise held up, but it wasn't without challenges. One evening, as she and Emeka shared a meal of roasted plantains and groundnuts, he noticed the holes in her ears again. "You never did tell me more about your ear holes," he said, popping a groundnut into his mouth. "Is it really a tradition in your village? Or were you just trying to avoid my question?" Adana stiffened, keeping her face as neutral as possible. "It's a tradition," she said firmly, deepening her voice. "All the boys in my village get their ears pierced when they come of age. It's a sign of bravery." "Bravery, huh?" Emeka said, leaning back. "What's so brave about getting your ears pierced?" Adana shrugged, trying to sound casual. "It's about enduring pain, proving you can handle it." Emeka squinted at her, as if trying to decide whether to believe her. "And what happens if you don't? If a boy refuses?" "They don't refuse," Adana said quickly. "It's not an option." Emeka chuckled. "Sounds like a strict village. I'd have gotten in trouble for sure." Adana forced a laugh, but inside, she felt a pang of guilt. Every lie she told seemed to pile up, and she worried it was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down. Meanwhile, whispers of the missing princess had begun to spread beyond the palace walls. In Okigwe, King Obiagu had sent soldiers to search for Adana, but their efforts had yielded no results. The court was abuzz with rumors, and Prince Obinna, ever the opportunist, used the situation to his advantage. "She's run away out of shame," he told the court elders, his voice dripping with mock concern. "It's unfortunate, but perhaps this is a sign that the kingdom needs stronger leadership." Queen Ifeanyi, seated beside the king, glared at Obinna. "Watch your tongue, prince. My daughter's courage and intelligence are unmatched. She will return when she is ready." Obinna smirked, but he said no more. The king's anger simmered beneath the surface, but he remained silent, his thoughts heavy with worry for his daughter. Back in Amankwu, Adana continued to navigate her new life, though the weight of her secret grew heavier with each passing day. Emeka's presence was both a comfort and a challenge. He had a way of drawing her out of her shell, making her laugh and forget her worries, if only for a moment. But he also had a way of asking questions that cut too close to the truth. One afternoon, as they watched a group of performers in the market square, Emeka turned to her suddenly. "Dan, do you ever feel like you're pretending to be someone you're not?" Adana's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" "I mean, sometimes I feel like I'm putting on a show, trying to be what people expect. But deep down, I'm not sure if that's really me." Adana swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I think everyone feels that way sometimes." "Yeah," Emeka said, nodding slowly. "But it's different with you. It's like you're carrying something heavy, and you're afraid to let anyone see it." Adana didn't respond. She couldn't. The truth was too close, and she wasn't ready to face it. Not with Emeka, not with anyone. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the market, Adana sat alone under the same tree where she had first met Emeka. She stared at the horizon, wondering how long she could keep up the charade. Her voice, her movements, even the way she stood. It all felt like a performance, one that drained her more with each passing day. But what choice did she have? To reveal herself was to invite ridicule, rejection, and perhaps even danger. For now, she would remain Dan, the quiet, strong laborer who kept his secrets close. The night air was cool and still, but Adana's thoughts churned like a restless storm. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow, she would figure out her next step. But deep down, she knew that the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. The next morning, the market square was alive with its usual chaos. Traders called out their wares, carts creaked under the weight of goods, and children wove through the crowd, laughing and playing. Adana, still living as Dan, sat near the edge of the square, taking a rare moment of quiet. The sounds of the market buzzed around her, but her mind was far away, still weighed down by Emeka's words the day before. "Dan!" Emeka's voice broke through her thoughts. She looked up to see him bounding toward her, his wooden box of storytelling props slung over his shoulder. He had that infectious grin on his face, the one that always seemed to bring trouble with it. "I've been looking for you," Emeka said, plopping down beside her. "I've got an idea, and I need your help." Adana tilted her head, her deepened voice steady. "What kind of idea?" Emeka leaned closer, lowering his voice as if he were about to share a great secret. "There's a festival coming up in a few days, one of the biggest in Amankwu. Everyone will be there, traders, nobles, maybe even travelers from far-off kingdoms. It's the perfect chance to tell a story that'll make people remember my name." Adana raised an eyebrow. "What does that have to do with me?" "Everything," Emeka said, throwing his hands up dramatically. "You're my muse, Dan. Don't you see? You're strong, mysterious, quiet. But there's something about you that makes people curious. I want to tell a story about someone like you. Someone who carries secrets but has the strength of 10 men. Adana's stomach churned. The last thing she wanted was for anyone to look too closely at her, or the secrets she was carrying. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said carefully. "Why not?" Emeka asked, his grin fading slightly. "It's a compliment, Dan. You're the most interesting person I've met since I came to this town. Don't you want people to hear a story inspired by you?" Adana shifted uncomfortably. I'm just a worker, Emika. There's nothing special about me. That's where you're wrong, Emika said, his voice softening. Everyone has a story, Dan. Even you. Especially you. For the next few days, Emika threw himself into preparing for the festival. He worked tirelessly on his story, rehearsing lines under his breath and carving new wooden props to bring his tale to life. Adana tried to keep her distance, focusing on her work and avoiding his questions. But Emika had a way of finding her, no matter how hard she tried to disappear. One afternoon, as they sat beneath their usual tree, Emika began sketching out the details of his story. It's about a hero, he said, his voice brimming with excitement. A man who seems ordinary at first but carries a great secret. He's stronger than anyone else, not just in his body but in his heart. And when the time comes, he'll use that strength to save the people he cares about. Adana watched him silently, her chest tightening with every word. She could feel the weight of her own secret pressing down on her, heavier than ever. What's his secret? She asked, her voice lower than usual. Emika grinned. That's the best part. The audience won't find out until the very end. It'll keep them guessing the whole time. Adana looked away, her hands clenching into fists. And what happens when they find out? Emika paused, his smile fading slightly. That's up to the hero. If he's brave enough, he'll show them who he really is. And if they're wise enough, they'll see him for the person he's always been. Adana swallowed hard, her throat dry. And if they don't? Then they're fools, Emika said simply. Because a true hero doesn't need anyone's approval. He just needs to be himself. The night of the festival arrived quickly, and the market square was transformed into a vibrant sea of color and light. Lanterns hung from every stall, casting a warm glow over the bustling crowd. Music filled the air, blending with the laughter and chatter of festival goers. Adana, still disguised as Dan, stood near the edge of the square, trying to stay out of sight. Emika was at the center of it all, his wooden box propped open and his carved figures arranged neatly inside. A small crowd had already gathered, eager to hear his tale. He caught sight of Adana and waved her over, his grin as wide as ever. Dan, you're just in time. Stay close. I need your strength if this story falls flat. Adana hesitated, then made her way to the edge of the crowd, keeping her head low. She didn't want to draw attention to herself, but something about Emika's energy made it impossible to walk away. Emika began his story, his voice rising and falling with practiced ease. He spun a tale of a mysterious hero, a man who lived among ordinary people but carried a great burden. The hero's strength was unmatched, but it was his kindness and courage that set him apart. As Emika spoke, he brought his characters to life with his carved figures, moving them in time with his words. The crowd was captivated, their eyes fixed on Emika as he built toward the climax of his tale. Adana, despite herself, felt a pang of admiration for him. He had a gift, a way of making people feel connected to his stories, even her. But then, as the hero's secret was about to be revealed, a group of royal soldiers entered the square. Adana's breath caught in her throat as she saw the soldiers, their uniforms gleaming in the lantern light. She recognized them immediately. They were from Okigwe. Her father had sent them to find her. The crowd parted to let the soldiers pass, their murmurs growing louder. The leader of the group, a tall man with a stern expression, stepped forward and addressed the crowd. We are looking for Princess Adana of Okigwe, he announced. If anyone has seen her or knows of her whereabouts, step forward now. Adana's heart pounded in her chest. She ducked her head, pulling the scarf tighter around her face. She couldn't let them find her. Not here, not now. Emika glanced at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. Princess, he whispered. What's going on? Adana shook her head, her voice barely audible. I don't know. The soldiers moved through the square, their eyes scanning the crowd. One of them passed dangerously close to Adana, and she held her breath, praying he wouldn't notice her. But then, as the soldier turned to leave, his gaze lingered on her for a moment too long. You there, he said, pointing at her. What's your name? Adana froze, her mind racing. Dan, she said, forcing her voice to stay low and steady. The soldier frowned, stepping closer. You look familiar. Have we met before? No, Adana said quickly, her voice strained. I'm just a worker. The soldier narrowed his eyes, but before he could say anything more, Emeka stepped forward. Leave him alone, he said, his voice firm. He's just a laborer, like the rest of us. The soldier hesitated, then nodded. Fine, but if you see anything suspicious, you'll report it to us. Understood. Emeka nodded, his jaw tight. The soldiers moved on, and the tension in the square began to ease. But for Adana, the danger was far from over. As the crowd dispersed and the festival wound down, Emeka pulled Adana aside, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. What was that about? Why were they looking at you? Adana avoided his gaze, her chest tight. I don't know. Maybe they thought I looked like someone else. Dan, Emeka said, his voice low. Don't lie to me. Who are you really? Adana felt the walls closing in around her. She wanted to tell him the truth to finally let someone in. But she couldn't. Not yet. I'm just a worker, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That's all you need to know. Emeka studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Fine, but if you ever want to tell me the truth, I'll be here. Adana nodded, grateful for his understanding but terrified of what would happen if he ever learned the full truth. As the festival lights faded into the night, she knew one thing for certain. Her secret was getting harder to keep. The next morning, the market town of Amankwu was quieter than usual. The festival had left its mark. Lanterns still hung from stalls, and scraps of decorations fluttered in the morning breeze. Traders moved more slowly, their energy drained from the previous night's excitement. For Adana, the quiet should have been a relief, but it only made her more anxious. The soldiers were still in town, and their presence was a constant reminder that her secret was hanging by a thread. She sat on a wooden bench near the edge of the market, watching the townspeople go about their day. Her scarf was pulled tighter than usual, and her heart jumped at every passing shadow. She couldn't stop replaying the events of the night before. The way the soldier had looked at her, how close she had come to being discovered. And then there was Emeka's question. He hadn't pressed her for answers, but she could feel his curiosity like a weight on her shoulders. Dan, a familiar voice called. Adana turned quickly to see Emeka walking toward her, his wooden box strapped to his back. His usual grin was missing, replaced by a look of quiet determination. She straightened her back, trying to appear calm, though her stomach churned with nerves. Morning, she said, her voice steady but low. Emeka sat down beside her, his eyes scanning her face. You didn't stay long at the festival after everything? I didn't want to be around the soldiers, Adana replied, looking away. I don't blame you, Emeka said, his voice softer now. But I need to know, Dan, what's going on? Why were they looking at you like that? Adana clenched her fists in her lap. She had known this conversation was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. They weren't looking at me, she said, forcing her voice to stay calm. They were looking for someone else. Emeka tilted his head, studying her. You're lying. Adana's chest tightened. She turned to him, her deepened voice sharp now. Why do you care, Emeka? Why can't you just leave it alone? Because I'm your friend. Emeka shot back, his voice rising. Friends don't just sit by when something's wrong. You're hiding something, Dan, and I can't help you if you won't tell me the truth. Adana froze, the weight of his words sinking in. She wanted to tell him, to finally let someone share the burden she had been carrying. But the fear of what he might think, of how he might react, held her back. I can't, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. You wouldn't understand. Emeka leaned closer, his tone urgent. Then help me understand. Whatever it is, it can't be worse than what I'm imagining. Adana shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. She couldn't do it. Not here, not now. I need to go, she muttered, standing up. Dan, wait. Emeka started, but she was already walking away, her scarf pulled tighter around her head. Adana spent the rest of the day avoiding Emeka and keeping to the quieter parts of the market. She helped unload a shipment of yams, earning enough coins to buy a small meal, but even the simple task of lifting sacks felt heavier than usual. Her mind was too full, her chest too tight. As the sun began to set, she found herself wandering toward the edge of the market, where the noise of the town faded into the soft hum of the surrounding fields. She sat beneath a tree, the same one where she and Emeka had spent so many afternoons talking. The familiar spot felt different now, lonely, heavy with unspoken words. "Dan," Emeka's voice called again, breaking the quiet. Adana turned to see him standing a few feet away, his wooden box set aside. His face was serious, but there was no anger in his eyes, only concern. "I thought you might be here," he said, stepping closer. Adana didn't respond. She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together nervously. "I'm sorry," Emeka said, his voice softer now. "I didn't mean to push you earlier. I want to help." "You can't," Adana said, her voice low and strained. "Maybe not," Emeka admitted, sitting down beside her. "But I can listen." The silence between them stretched out, heavy and full of unsaid things. Adana's throat tightened as she tried to find the right words, the right way to explain everything. But how could she? How could she make him understand what it was like to live with a secret so big it felt like it could swallow her whole? "I'm not who you think I am," she said finally, her voice trembling. Emeka frowned, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Adana hesitated, the words catching in her throat. She couldn't say it. "Not yet. I mean, there's more to me than you know. That's all." Emeka nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Okay, then tell me when you're ready." Adana looked at him, surprised by his response. She had expected more questions, more pressure. But instead, he gave her space, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a small sense of relief. The next few days passed uneventfully, though the tension in the town remained. The soldiers continued their search for the missing princess, questioning traders and villagers alike. Adana kept her head down, avoiding crowded areas and staying close to her work. Emeka, true to his word, didn't press her further, but she could feel his eyes on her, always watching, always waiting. One afternoon, as they worked side by side loading crates onto a wagon, Emeka broke the silence. "You know, I've been thinking about the story I told at the festival." Adana glanced at him, her expression guarded. "What about it?" "I think I got it wrong," he said, his tone thoughtful. "The hero's secret. It's not something he has to hide. It's something he has to share." Adana's chest tightened, her hands pausing mid-lift. "Why?" "Because secrets only have power when we keep them hidden," Emeka said, meeting her gaze. "Once we let them out, they lose their hold on us." Adana didn't respond. She couldn't. His words cut too close, like he could see straight through her disguise. She turned back to her work, her heart pounding in her chest. That evening, as the town settled into its usual rhythm, Adana sat alone under the tree, her thoughts swirling like a storm. She knew Emeka was right. About secrets, about everything. But the fear of what might happen if she told the truth kept her frozen, unable to move forward or back. She thought of her father, of the soldiers still searching for her, of the life she had left behind. And then she thought of Emeka, of his kindness and his stubborn curiosity. He had stood up for her without knowing who she really was. He had given her space when she needed it most. Could she trust him with the truth? The question hung heavy in her mind as the night deepened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry her secret alone. Adana couldn't sleep that night. She lay awake in her small rented room, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts spinning like a wheel that wouldn't stop. The soldiers were still in town. Her secret felt heavier than ever, and Emeka's words from earlier kept echoing in her mind. Secrets only have power when we keep them hidden. She hated how true it felt. Hiding had kept her safe, but it had also trapped her. For weeks now, she'd been living in fear, dodging questions, avoiding connections, and walking on a tightrope that seemed to get thinner every day. And Emeka, stubborn, kind, and frustratingly curious, had seen through her walls in a way no one else had. By the time the first light of dawn peeked through her window, Adana had made a decision. She didn't know if it was the right one, but she couldn't keep living like this. She couldn't keep lying to someone who had stood by her when it mattered most. She found Emeka at their usual spot under the large tree at the edge of the market. He was sitting cross-legged on the ground, carving a new figure for his storytelling box. When he saw her approaching, he smiled, but it wasn't his usual carefree grin. There was something cautious about it, like he wasn't sure what to expect. "Morning," he said, setting his carving knife aside. "You're up early." Adana nodded, her heart pounding. "We need to talk." Emeka tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. "That sounds serious." "It is," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. I need to tell you something." Emeka straightened, giving her his full attention. "Okay, I'm listening." Adana took a deep breath, her hands trembling. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times, but now that it was here, the words felt impossible to say. "I'm not who you think I am," she began, her voice low and strained. "Dan isn't my real name." Emeka frowned, but he didn't interrupt. He just watched her, his gaze steady and patient. "My name is Adana," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "I'm the princess the soldiers have been looking for." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unshakable. Emeka blinked, his mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at her like he was trying to piece together a puzzle that suddenly made sense. "You're the princess?" he said finally, his voice quiet, almost disbelieving. Adana nodded, her throat tight. "Yes." For a long moment, Emeka just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he leaned back against the tree, exhaling sharply. "That actually explains a lot." Adana blinked, startled. "It does?" "Yeah," Emeka said, running a hand through his hair. "The way you act, the way you carry yourself, it's not like the other workers. I always thought you seemed different, but I didn't think, a princess." "I know it's hard to believe," Adana said quickly, her words tumbling out. "I left the palace because I didn't feel like I belonged there. People, they don't see me for who I am. They see what they want to see, and it's not always kind." Emeka nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "The soldiers, they're looking for you to take you back, aren't they?" "Yes," Adana said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't go back. Not yet. I'm not ready." Emeka was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the ground. Then he looked up at her, his eyes searching hers. "Why tell me now?" "Because I'm tired," Adana admitted, her voice trembling. "I'm tired of lying, of hiding. And I trust you." The words seemed to catch Emeka off guard. He stared at her for a moment longer, then nodded. "Okay." Adana blinked. "Okay." "Yeah," Emeka said, his voice firm now. "You trusted me with your secret, so I'll keep it. You don't have to explain anything else if you don't want to. Just let me know how I can help." A wave of relief washed over Adana, so strong that she felt like she might collapse. She had expected questions, anger, maybe even rejection. But instead, Emeka had given her exactly what she needed: understanding. The days that followed were both easier and harder for Adana. Easier because she no longer had to pretend with Emeka. She could be herself, at least around him. Harder because the soldiers hadn't left, and the risk of being discovered felt greater than ever. Emeka was careful to act normal around others, never giving away that he knew the truth. But when they were alone, he asked questions, not out of suspicion, but out of curiosity. "What's it like, being a princess?" he asked one evening as they shared a meal of roasted yams. "Do you have, 1,000 servants waiting on you all the time?" Adana chuckled, shaking her head. "It's not like that. We have servants, but it's not as glamorous as you think. There are a lot of rules, a lot of pressure. Everyone's always watching, waiting for you to mess up." "Sounds exhausting," Emeka said, taking a bite of yam. "No wonder you wanted to get away." It was, Adana admitted. But leaving wasn't just about that. I wanted to find out who I really am, without all the expectations. Emeka nodded, his expression thoughtful. Makes sense. So, what happens now? Are you just gonna keep hiding? Adana sighed, her gaze drifting to the horizon. I don't know. I can't stay here forever, but I'm not ready to go back. Not yet. Well, whatever you decide, Emeka said. His voice steady. You've got me in your corner. Adana smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel so alone. But peace was short-lived. One afternoon, as Adana and Emeka were walking through the market, a familiar voice cut through the crowd. There she is. Adana froze, her heart pounding as she turned to see the soldier from the festival pointing directly at her. He was flanked by two others, their swords gleaming in the sunlight. The crowd began to part, whispers spreading like wildfire. Run, Emeka said urgently, grabbing her arm. Adana didn't need to be told twice. She tore through the market, her scarf slipping from her head as she ran. Emeka was right behind her, weaving through the narrow alleys with practiced ease. The soldiers shouted, their heavy boots pounding against the dirt. This way, Emeka shouted, pulling her into a side street. They ducked into a small storage shed, slamming the door shut behind them. Adana's chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, her mind racing. They're going to find us, she said, panic creeping into her voice. Not if we stay quiet, Emeka whispered, his hand on her shoulder. We'll figure this out. The sound of footsteps grew louder, then stopped just outside the shed. Adana held her breath, her heart hammering in her chest. She could hear the soldiers talking, their voices muffled but tense. They saw us come this way, one of them said. Spread out. Check every building. Emeka's grip on her shoulder tightened. When I say run, you run. Got it? Adana nodded, her entire body trembling. She didn't know where they could go or how they would escape, but she trusted Emeka. She had to. The door creaked as one of the soldiers pushed it open. Adana's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then, without warning, Emeka shoved a crate into the soldier's path, sending him stumbling backward. Run! Emeka shouted, pulling her toward the back of the shed. They burst through a small side door and into the open air, the sound of shouting behind them. Adana didn't look back. She just ran, her feet pounding against the ground as she followed Emeka toward the edge of the town. When they finally stopped, hidden among the tall grasses of the surrounding fields, Adana collapsed to her knees, her breath ragged. Emeka crouched beside her, his face flushed but determined. That was close, he said, his voice low. Adana nodded, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Emeka smiled, though his eyes were serious. We're not done yet. We need to figure out what to do next. Adana wiped her eyes, her heart still racing. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. She couldn't keep running forever. It was time to face her past and her future head-on. Adana sat among the tall grasses with Emeka beside her, the sounds of the market town fading into the distance. The soldiers had stopped searching nearby, but the tension in her chest refused to let go. She knew this couldn't go on. They couldn't keep running forever. It was time to make a choice. Emeka broke the silence first, his voice calm but firm. We can't stay here long. They'll search the fields eventually. Adana nodded, staring at the horizon. Her heart was heavy with fear and uncertainty, but she knew Emeka was right. I need to go back, she said softly. Emeka's head snapped toward her, his brows knitting together. Back? To the palace? Yes. Adana took a deep breath, her voice steadier now. I've been running for too long. It's time I stop hiding and face my family, my kingdom. Everything. Emeka frowned, his eyes searching hers. Are you sure about this? Once you go back, there's no turning around. I'm sure, Adana said, though her hands trembled. I don't know what will happen, but I can't keep living like this. If I'm ever going to be free, I need to reclaim who I am. Emeka nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Then I'm coming with you. Adana blinked, surprised. What? No, Emika, this isn't your fight. It is now, Emika said firmly. You trusted me with your secret, and I'm not going to let you face this alone. Besides, he added with a small smile, someone's got to watch your back. Adana felt a wave of gratitude so strong it nearly brought her to tears. She nodded, her voice quiet but steady. Thank you. By the time they reached the outskirts of Okigwe, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape. The towering walls of the palace loomed in the distance, both familiar and intimidating. Adana's heart pounded as memories of her life within those walls came rushing back. Her father's stern gaze, her mother's gentle hands, and the endless whispers about her appearance. Emika noticed her hesitation and placed a hand on her shoulder. You can do this, he said, his voice soft but encouraging. You're stronger than you think. Adana nodded, drawing strength from his words. Together, they approached the gates, their steps slow but deliberate. The guards at the entrance straightened as they approached, their eyes narrowing when they saw her. Halt, one of them barked. State your business. Adana pulled back her scarf, revealing her face. The guard's eyes widened in shock, and one of them stammered, Princess Adana? Yes, she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. I've returned. The news of her arrival spread through the palace like wildfire. By the time Adana and Emika reached the throne room, a crowd had gathered, courtiers, servants, and soldiers, all whispering and staring. At the center of it all stood King Obiagu and Queen Ifunanya, their expressions a mix of relief, shock, and something else Adana couldn't quite place. Adana, her father said, his deep voice filling the room. You're alive. Adana stepped forward, her hands trembling but her chin held high. Yes, father. I'm sorry for the pain I've caused, but I had to leave. I had to find myself. King Obiagu's brow furrowed, his gaze heavy with both anger and concern. And what have you found? Adana hesitated, searching for the right words. I found that I can't keep living in the shadows. I know I don't look like the princess people expect, but I am more than how I look. I have strength, courage, and a voice that deserves to be heard. And I won't hide it anymore. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Then, from the back of the crowd, a sharp voice cut through the quiet. This is an insult to the crown. It was Prince Obinna, stepping forward with a sneer on his face. She abandons her duty, runs off in disgrace, and now she dares to return as if nothing has happened? The people deserve better. Adana turned to face him, her jaw tightening. And what do you know of duty, Prince Obinna? You humiliated me in front of the court, cast me aside without a second thought. You don't care about the people. You care about your own pride. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Obinna's face darkened with anger. You dare speak to me like that? Yes, I dare, Adana said, her voice rising, because I've spent weeks among the people you claim to care about. I've seen their struggles, their strength, their hopes, and I know that a leader isn't someone who looks perfect or follows every rule. A leader is someone who fights for their people, no matter what. The room erupted into murmurs, the courtiers exchanging glances. Queen Ifunanya stepped forward then, her hands clasped tightly. Adana, she said softly, we've missed you terribly, but you must understand, the road ahead will not be easy. People will question you, doubt you. I know, Adana said, her voice steady, but I'm ready to face them. I'm ready to be the princess this kingdom needs. King Obiagu studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he nodded. Very well. You've returned, and you've spoken your truth. Now it's time to prove yourself. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Adana worked tirelessly to earn the trust of the court and the people. She met with advisors, listened to the concerns of villagers, and even joined the palace guards in their training exercises. Emika stayed by her side through it all, his quick wit and steady presence a constant source of support. But not everyone was convinced. Obinna continued to spread doubt among the court, whispering that Adana's return was a threat to the kingdom's stability. The tension came to a head during a council meeting, where Obinna openly challenged her. What makes you think you're fit to lead? He demanded, his voice sharp. You ran away when things got hard. What's to stop you from doing it again? Adana met his gaze, her voice calm but firm. I ran because I needed to find my strength. And now that I have, nothing will make me run again. Her words silenced the room, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of doubt in Obina's eyes. The court began to murmur, their opinions slowly shifting. That evening, as Adana stood on the balcony overlooking the palace grounds, Emeka joined her. He leaned against the railing, his expression thoughtful. You're doing it, he said simply. Doing what? Adana asked. Proving them wrong, Emeka said with a grin. Showing them who you really are. Adana smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. I couldn't have done it without you. Emeka shrugged. Maybe not. But you're the one with the strength to see it through. Adana looked out at the horizon, the lights of the kingdom twinkling in the distance. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. Not because the road ahead would be easy, but because she finally knew she was ready to face it. The days after Adana's return to the palace were filled with both hope and tension. She had stood her ground, challenged Prince Obina, and begun earning the trust of the people. But not everyone had been convinced. Whispers still swirled through the palace halls, and Adana could feel the weight of every curious glance and skeptical murmur. It was exhausting, but she refused to let it break her. One afternoon, Adana found herself in the palace courtyard, watching the guards train. She had come to value these moments of quiet observation, where she could clear her mind and focus on her next steps. Emeka joined her, as he often did, leaning against the stone wall with his usual easygoing grin. You're becoming a bit of a legend, you know, he said, his tone light. Adana raised an eyebrow. A legend? Yeah, Emeka said, crossing his arms. The people are talking about the princess who came back stronger than ever. Some of the traders are even telling stories about you in the market. Adana chuckled, though her smile was tinged with unease. Stories can be dangerous. Not if they're the right ones, Emeka said. Besides, you've already proven you're more than just a story. Adana glanced at him, her heart warming at his words. You always know what to say, don't you? It's a gift, Emeka replied with a wink. Later that evening, Adana was summoned to the throne room for an official gathering. The courtiers and advisors were assembled, their faces a mix of curiosity and doubt. At the center of the room stood King Obiagu, his expression as stern as ever, and Queen Ifunanya, her gaze soft but watchful. As Adana entered, the room fell silent. She felt every eye on her, the weight of their expectations pressing down like a heavy cloak. But she kept her chin high and her steps steady. She had spent too long hiding to falter now. Adana, her father began, his deep voice carrying through the hall. You have returned to us with courage and determination. But the people must see that you are ready to lead, not just in words, but in actions. Adana nodded, her voice clear and strong. I understand, father. What do you ask of me? King Obiagu gestured to the gathered court. Tomorrow you will address the kingdom. You will stand before the people and show them who you are. Not as the daughter they once knew, but as the leader they deserve. The murmurs in the room grew louder, and Adana felt a flicker of unease. Speaking before the court was one thing. Addressing the entire kingdom was something else entirely. But she met her father's gaze and nodded again. I will do it. That night, as she stood on the balcony overlooking the palace grounds, Adana's thoughts churned with nervous energy. The idea of standing before the people, exposing herself to their judgment, filled her with both fear and determination. Emeka appeared beside her, as if sensing her unease. He leaned against the railing, his expression thoughtful. Big day tomorrow, he said. Adana nodded, her gaze fixed on the distant lights of the town. I don't know if I'm ready. You're more than ready, Emeka said, his tone firm. You've faced soldiers, court politics, and a prince who tried to tear you down. A speech is nothing compared to that. It's not just a speech, Adana said, her voice quiet. It's everything. It's my chance to show them that I belong. But what if they don't see it? What if they still doubt me? Emeka turned to face her, his eyes steady. Then you remind them who you are. You've already proven your strength, Adana. Now you just need to trust it. Adana looked at him, her chest tightening. You always believe in me, don't you? Always, Emika said with a small smile. And so will they. You'll see. The next day, the palace courtyard was packed with people from all corners of the kingdom. Traders, farmers, nobles, and villagers alike had gathered to hear the princess speak. The air buzzed with anticipation, and the crowd's energy was both exhilarating and overwhelming. Adana stood at the edge of the raised platform, her heart pounding as she glanced at the sea of faces before her. Emika was by her side, his presence steady and reassuring. You've got this, he whispered, giving her a small nod. Adana took a deep breath and stepped forward. The murmurs in the crowd quieted as she raised her hands, commanding their attention. For a moment, the silence felt suffocating. But then she spoke, her voice clear and steady. My people, she began, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. I stand before you today not as the princess you once knew, but as the woman I have become. For too long, I have hidden in the shadows, afraid of what you might see. But today, I show you everything. My strength, my flaws, my truth. The crowd remained silent, their expressions unreadable. Adana's hands trembled slightly, but she pushed forward. I know I do not look like the princess you expected. I have heard the whispers, felt the stares, but I am more than my appearance. I am a daughter of this kingdom, and I carry its strength in my heart. I have walked among you, seen your struggles, your hopes, your dreams, and I am here to tell you that I will fight for you with every part of who I am. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Adana's chest tightened. But then, from somewhere near the back, a voice called out, Show us your strength. Adana paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. The challenge hung in the air, and for a moment, doubt flickered in her mind. But then she straightened, her resolve hardening. Very well, she said, her voice firm. Bring me a test and I will show you. The crowd buzzed with excitement as a heavy wooden staff was brought forward. Adana took it in her hands, its weight familiar and grounding. She stepped down from the platform into the open space of the courtyard, her muscles tense but ready. One of the palace guards stepped forward, his expression cautious. Your Highness, are you sure? Yes, Adana said simply. The guard nodded and raised his own staff, stepping into a defensive stance. The crowd held its breath as the two began to circle each other, the tension crackling like a storm about to break. The first strike came quickly, the guard's staff slicing through the air toward Adana. She blocked it with ease, the wooden poles clashing with a sharp crack. The crowd gasped, their excitement building as the two exchanged blows. Adana moved with precision and strength, her training as a princess shining through with every movement. She struck hard, forcing the guard back step by step, until finally, with a swift and decisive strike, she disarmed him. His staff clattered to the ground, and the courtyard erupted into cheers. Adana stood tall, her chest heaving as she faced the crowd. For the first time, she saw something new in their eyes, not doubt, but respect. That evening, as the celebrations began, Adana found herself back on the balcony, watching the lights of the kingdom below. Emika joined her as he always did, his grin as bright as ever. You were incredible, he said. Adana smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. I couldn't have done it without you. Don't sell yourself short, Emika said. You're the one who stood up there and showed them who you are. I just stood on the sidelines, cheering. Adana looked at him, her chest tightening with gratitude and something deeper. You've always been more than that, Emika. You've been my friend, my support, my everything. Emika's grin softened, and for a moment, they just stood there, the silence between them filled with unspoken words. I'll always be here for you, Adana, he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. Adana smiled, her heart full. For the first time, she felt truly at peace, not just with her kingdom, but with herself. And as the lights of the celebration twinkled below, she knew that this was only the beginning of her journey. Together, She and Emeka would face whatever came next, one step at a time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like and subscribe. Here is another interesting story to watch. Click to watch now.